G'day YouTube viewer. Today I'm doing some circle work in Kalala to reflect the going around in circles I've done in recent decades, trying to find an answer to probably a 7-decade-old mystery. It's a mystery I've been trying to solve probably for 30 to 40 years, and it relates to my very early experience riding motorcycles, in fact my very first time on a motorcycle. Now, my story is a little bit more unusual than most, I guess, in how I got into motorcycling. The fact that I grew up on a farm and we had motorbikes is not so unusual, but the very first bike I had is very unusual. So the story goes, I guess I was around 6 or 7 years old, and I grew up in a very remote area with 3 properties and a post office, and the post office was run by an elderly gentleman and his wife. So the whole community was about probably 15 people. And so I was visiting his house one day, walking around the yard, and I spotted in the back veranda area the outlines, or just the wheel and part of a frame of what looked like a motorcycle of sorts. It didn't look like any motorcycle I'd seen pictures of or anything at all. And so he noticed I was paying attention to this and brought it out to give me a look. And he saw how interested I was, and to cut a long story short, he got it running again and he gave it to me to learn to ride a motorbike. Now this resulted in me riding a motorcycle before I'd ever ridden a push bike. Growing up on the farm, I could do some things that were a little bit unusual, I guess. I could drive a tractor before I could ride a push bike, for example. I couldn't reach the pedals from the seat, so I used to have to hop off the seat to put the brake on, or things like that, change gears, etc. And so it wasn't unusual for me to have experience with engines and motors from a very young age. And I needed all my gumption and all my limited experience at that stage to be able to ride this motorcycle, because this motorcycle had no clutch or handbrake or foot brake or gear lever on that you used with your foot. Instead, it had a gear shifter on the handlebar. It had a little lug you pushed with your thumb, and all the way forward was second gear, halfway back was neutral, and all the way back was first. So you used your thumb to push it forward and pull it back. To start the motorcycle, you left it in gear. Didn't have a clutch, so you couldn't hold the clutch and then let it down to roll start it. But I would get on a hill and put it in second gear and put the throttle on a little bit, and I'll talk about the throttle in a second, but just run it in gear down a hill until the engine fired. Now the engine wasn't the original motor, it was a lawnmower engine that was bolted onto the side where the original engine would have been. And it had a flywheel, and one of the obstacles, or one of the challenges I had with riding this bike is if I was wearing jeans or pants, they'd often get caught in the flywheel. The footrest, the foot pegs were just rubber, or something similar to rubber, just around 2 metal pegs that jutted out the side of the frame, and they tended to roll around and make a noise as well, not that you could hear them much over the sound of the engine. Now, the bodywork of this bike was, I guess, a bit like a step-through style, and it was a bit like the skeleton of a motorcycle. All the original parts weren't there. And the colour was sort of a whitish grey with parts of red. So it had been painted a few times over the years, so I'm not sure what the original colour was. The seat had no padding. The petrol tank was under the seat as well. The rear suspension was very basic springs. There was a pivot in the frame where the engine and swing arm sort of worked. It's a bit hard to describe that. But when I tell you how I solved this mystery, you'll be able to see how that swing arm pivots in a video that I'll tell you about. There were no lights or clocks of any variety in terms of tacho or speedo or anything like that. I'm not sure what it originally had. but it was the bare bones of what was the original bike. So it had no, when you see the video I'm going to tell you about in a minute, you'll notice that there's sort of a bearing that protects the legs and things like that. It had none of that. This was the bare bones skeleton of what was a bike from earlier years, and it turns out it was a bike from the 1950s, a very cheap bike. I knew it was a BSA, and because he told me that at the time, that it was a very inexpensive bike made by BSA to compete with some of the scooters and things coming from various parts of Europe and other parts of the world at the time. I think the first one was made in 1957 evidently, and I'll tell you what the name of the bike is very shortly. Now, to ride this bike was a very noisy affair. It was also a challenge in that it had no brakes. The throttle, if you think about lawnmowers from decades ago with the silver lever you turned and fixed into the position of the revs you want, that's what it had on the handlebar. On the right-hand side, by memory, the gears were on the left-hand side, and they were the only controls. I can't even remember having a choke. So the throttle was a bit like a very basic cruise control, I suppose, because you turned it, and wherever you stopped turning it, that were the revs that you were going, and it would stay that until you physically pulled it back or increased it. And so it's not like a throttle on a normal bike where you let it go and it'll return back to, 1,000 revs or something like that. This didn't return until you physically moved it. It used to blow, being a two-stroke lawnmower motor, it blew heaps of smoke. And I think more smoke than dust, because it didn't go far enough to stir up too much dust. It was a real interesting bike to ride, and I can only imagine bikes from a century or 75 years ago being more complicated in terms of being able to ride. The wheels and tyres were original, I think, fairly thin and narrow, so it did get bogged in sand and mud very easily, but I didn't know any better, and I loved to ride this machine, for want of a better word. And it was very effective and was very slow. I think top speed was probably 15 mile an hour, something like that, but it felt fast because I'd never ridden anything like it before. And it made a lot of noise. It was very, very noisy. I burnt myself quite often on the inside of my calf muscle because the motor was right next to my leg, basically. So it wasn't exhausting me to worry about, it was more the motor. So how did I solve this mystery? Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I started watching YouTube. I'd tried to look it up on Google and online and on websites and everything. About 3 or 4 years ago, I got into watching YouTube, particularly motorcycle channels, which I hadn't done before. And then I used to watch videos or YouTube channels that would visit museums in the United Kingdom and places like that, particularly the UK, because BSA came out of the UK, of course. And trying to see all the models of the BSAs, because I knew it was a BSA, to find a bike that remotely looked like the one I used to have, and I could never see it. And then once, I guess about 6 months ago, I was watching a tour on a channel that was talking about the history of the BSAs, and they went into a museum, and there was one bike front on. I just caught a glimpse of it, and I thought, oh, that does look a little bit like it, but it wasn't enough to really convince me that that was a bike. I zoomed in, I couldn't tell what the make was, what the model was, or anything like that. And so that didn't really achieve much, but finally I had seen one that remotely resembled this bike I rode. But this had some bearings, some leg protection, and it had a few more levers and things, and the motor was much more closer to the frame of the bike and things like that. The mystery remained unresolved until one day I was watching a YouTube channel called The Mighty Garage. It was talking about BSA motorcycles and this collection a man in the United States had. And the episode was about his favourite bike. And at the beginning of that episode, there it was. It was mounted sitting high on a wall. All the other bikes were on the floor, but this one was elevated. It was like on a shelf, because this is a very small and very light bike. And when asked about what his favourite motorcycle was in the collection, he went straight to this, and it was called a BSA Dandy. And there it was, sitting there in all its glory, in all its original state. He'd managed to, there were no BSA Dandys sold in the United States, so he tells the story of how he got this one, how it had been pulled apart, put in the boot of a car. All the parts were there basically. He restored it, had to search for a few parts just to get it back to working order. And then once he'd got it back to that state, he put it up on a shelf, taking pride of place in this workshop of his. And he spoke about how he doesn't ride it or anything else, because if something breaks, he basically can't get parts for it. So it turns out it's one of the rarest motorcycles you can get, and it filled in that part of the story that I knew nothing about. What this bike originally was, what it was made for, and then he talks about how it was made as a very cheap bike, how it was very unreliable, it overheated easily, how the carburetor was inside the casing of the motor, and tended to overheat as well, and told the whole story of this bike, which was quite fascinating. But finally I had my answer, and I wouldn't have that if it hadn't been for YouTube. So, mystery solved. Thank you, YouTube, and thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to seeing you soon.